Right now, somewhere on this planet, a farmer is harvesting enough wheat to feed 1,000 people. And right now, somewhere else, a child is going to bed hungry. Not because there isn't enough food, because we've built a system that produces abundance and scarcity at the same time. Before we start, a quick roll call. Write in the comments which part of this planet you're watching from, and then just listen and enjoy. Here's what most people don't know. The world produces enough food today to feed 10 billion people. We're only 8.2 billion. Yet in 2024, 673 million of us went hungry. That's 1 in 11 human beings on Earth experiencing food deprivation severe enough to threaten life itself. In 2025, that number climbed to 295 million facing acute hunger, the 6th consecutive annual increase. And here's the paradox that should wake us up. We already grow the food. We just can't get it where it needs to go, or we waste it, or people simply can't afford it. But this isn't a video about the problems we have today. This is about the problems coming tomorrow. Because by 2050, 25 years from now, closer than the distance to the year 2000, there will be between 9.7 and 10 billion of us. Most projections settle on 10 billion as the number we need to prepare for. That's 1.8 billion more mouths than we feed now. 1.8 billion more people expecting breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day. And they won't just want more food. They'll want different food. As countries develop economically, diets change. People eat less grain and more meat. The average person on Earth consumed 36.4 kilograms of meat per year in recent decades. By 2050, that number is projected to reach 45.3 kilograms. Meat requires vastly more resources to produce than plants. A kilogram of beef needs 15,000 liters of water. A kilogram of wheat needs 1,500. We're not just feeding more people. We're feeding more expensive appetites. So the question becomes, can we actually do this? Can we produce 56% more food than we do now without destroying the ecosystems that make food production possible in the first place? Because that's the other half of the equation. Agriculture already uses 70% of global freshwater withdrawals. It occupies 38% of Earth's land surface. It generates 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If we simply scale up what we're doing now, we'd need 593 million more hectares of agricultural land. That's roughly the size of India. Land we don't have. And if we converted forests and grasslands to get it, we'd release 11 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions annually. The planet can't absorb that and remain stable. 3 impossible gaps then. A 56% food gap, a 593 million in hectare land gap, an 11 gigaton emissions gap. Close those gaps while feeding 10 billion people, and you've solved one of the defining challenges of this century. Some people hear those numbers and think, apocalypse, famine, collapse. Others hear them and think, technology will save us. Vertical farms, lab-grown meat, AI-optimized crops. Both responses miss something important. This isn't a problem with one solution. It's a transformation that's already underway, unfolding in research labs and experimental farms and policy meetings across every continent. What we're witnessing isn't a crisis waiting to happen. It's a quiet revolution in how humanity feeds itself, driven by necessity and enabled by tools that didn't exist a generation ago. And that revolution is happening because it has to. Because 80% of those 10 billion people will live in cities by 2050. Because climate patterns are shifting faster than traditional agriculture can adapt. Because the young farmers who would normally inherit the land are moving to urban jobs, leaving aging populations to work fields that require younger bodies. Because supply chains that stretch thousands of miles are vulnerable to disruption in ways that became painfully obvious during recent global shocks. The farmers growing food in 2050 won't look like farmers from 1950 or even 2000. Some will work in climate-controlled towers, where crops grow in stacked layers under LED lights, producing 240 times more food per square meter than traditional fields, while using 98% less water. Some will manage herds that exist only as cell cultures in bioreactors, producing meat without animals. Some will guide fleets of autonomous robots through fields monitored by thousands of sensors, adjusting water and nutrients in real time based on data flowing from satellites overhead. Some will harvest protein from the ocean without catching a single fish, cultivating seaweed and shellfish that actually improve water quality as they grow. These aren't fantasies. They're systems in operation today, at scales still small but growing steadily. The question isn't whether these technologies can work. Many already do. The question is whether they can scale fast enough, become affordable enough, and gain acceptance widely enough to close those three impossible gaps before 2050 arrives. Over the next episodes, we're going to walk through this transformation piece by piece, not as cheerleaders for technology, not as prophets of doom, but as people trying to understand how change happens when it must happen. We'll look at vertical farms that turn warehouses into food factories, at precision agriculture, where AI and sensors eliminate waste before it occurs, at gene editing tools that make crops resilient to droughts that would have killed them a decade ago, at the staggering amount of food we already produce but simply throw away, at the 71% of Earth's surface we've barely begun to farm, the ocean. Each episode will focus on one piece of this puzzle. Each piece is necessary. None alone is sufficient. Together, they form a picture of how 10 billion people might eat without turning Earth into a depleted husk incapable of supporting the generations that come after. This isn't about predicting the future with certainty. Nobody can do that. Too many variables, too many unknowns, too many decisions not yet made. But we can look at the trajectories already in motion. We can examine what's working, what's struggling, what's still theoretical. We can be honest about the challenges while remaining curious about the solutions. Because here's what history shows us. Humans adapt. We've always adapted. We learned to cultivate wild grasses and turn them into wheat. We learned to preserve food and built civilizations that could survive winters. We learned to breed crops for higher yields and fed billions more than previous generations thought possible. The Green Revolution of the 1960s doubled crop yields in 2 decades using selective breeding and fertilizer. We're on the edge of changes that make that revolution look incremental. The 10 billion people of 2050 will eat. The question is what that costs. Whether we do it by expanding agriculture until forests become fields and rivers run dry, or whether we do it by transforming how we produce food in ways that use less land, less water, less energy. Whether we waste 30% of what we grow or build systems that waste almost nothing. Whether we rely on methods developed for a climate that no longer exists or develop new methods for the climate we actually have. That's what this video is about. Not whether we can feed 10 billion people. Whether we can feed them without destroying the systems that make feeding anyone possible. Let's find out how. For 10,000 years, farming has meant one thing: spreading out. Find fertile ground, clear it, plant seeds across as much land as you can manage, wait for rain, hope nothing goes wrong. Repeat next season. We built civilization on horizontal agriculture, and it worked. For a while. But here's the problem with spreading out. We're running out of room to spread. By 2050, 80% of humanity will live in cities, not near cities, in them. Dense urban centers, where land costs more per square meter than most people earn in a month. Where the nearest traditional farm might be 50, 100, even 3,000 miles away. Where a head of lettuce travels further in its short life than most humans did in the entire 20th century. So we did what humans do when we run out of space. We started building up. Vertical farming isn't new as a concept. The idea of stacking plants to save space has been around for decades. What's new is that it finally works at commercial scale, producing real food for real people at prices that actually compete with traditional agriculture. And the numbers behind this shift aren't incremental improvements. They're transformations. A well-designed vertical farm uses 98% less water than a conventional field growing the same crop. 98%. Not through some exotic future technology, but through basic physics. In a traditional field, most irrigation water evaporates or runs off before plants can use it. In a controlled environment, water circulates in a closed system. What the plants don't absorb gets recaptured and reused. There's no evaporation because there's no sun beating down. No runoff because there's no rain washing nutrients into rivers. The land efficiency matters even more. A vertical farm can produce 240 times more food per square meter than a traditional farm. 240 times. That's not a typo. By stacking growing layers vertically and harvesting continuously instead of seasonally, these facilities turn what would normally be a storage warehouse into a food production powerhouse. Eden Green Technologies facility in Texas, for example, grows 5 million pounds of leafy greens annually while using 99% less land than would be needed for the same output using conventional methods. Think about what that means for feeding 10 billion people without converting forests into farmland. If we can produce the same amount of food on 1% of the land, suddenly that 593 million hectare gap we talked about last episode becomes manageable. We're not trying to find new land to plow. We're using the urban space we've already built. The warehouses sitting empty, the rooftops doing nothing but collecting rain. This is what controlled environment agriculture actually looks like in practice, not science fiction. Industrial facilities where crops grow in stacked towers or horizontal trays under LED lights, calibrated to specific wavelengths that optimize photosynthesis. Temperature controlled to the degree. Humidity monitored constantly. Nutrients delivered directly to roots through hydroponic or aeroponic systems, where plants grow in water or mist instead of soil. The Eden Green model uses a hybrid approach. Vertical greenhouses that capture natural sunlight while maintaining environmental control. This reduces the single biggest cost challenge in vertical farming, which is energy. Growing plants under artificial light works, but those LEDs consume electricity, a lot of it. Traditional vertical farms and windowless warehouses can use 90% more energy than greenhouse-based systems. Eden Green's design cuts that by using Texas sunshine for photosynthesis while still controlling temperature, humidity, and nutrient delivery. It's the middle path between a field and a fully artificial growing chamber. And that energy question matters because critics of vertical farming often point to electricity consumption as the fatal flaw. They're not entirely wrong. If you're powering LED lights with coal-fired electricity, you're not solving environmental problems, you're just shifting them. But most vertical farms are designing around renewable energy from the start. Solar panels on roofs, wind power contracts, battery systems that store energy during off-peak hours and release it when the grid is stressed. The technology is young enough that sustainability is being built into the architecture rather than retrofitted later. There's another advantage that doesn't show up in water and land statistics, but matters just as much: consistency. Traditional agriculture is gambling. You plant, you hope for the right amount of rain at the right time. You pray pests don't devastate the crop. You watch weather forecasts with anxiety every spring and fall. A drought wipes out your yield. A flood drowns your fields. A late frost kills seedlings. A heat wave stunts growth. You harvest once, maybe twice a year. And if something goes wrong during that narrow window, you've lost months of work. Vertical farms harvest every week, sometimes every day. Because the environment is controlled, there are no seasons, no droughts or floods or frosts or heat waves. Pests can't get in, which means no pesticides, no herbicides, no fungicides. The plants grow in sterile conditions, monitored by sensors that detect problems before human eyes could see them. If a nutrient level drops, the system adjusts automatically. If temperature shifts half a degree, climate control responds. The result is predictable, consistent yields year-round. You know exactly how much food you'll produce next week, next month, next year. That predictability transforms food supply chains. Right now, grocery stores source produce from wherever it happens to be in season. California in winter, Mexico in spring, Canada in summer. The logistics are complex, expensive, and fragile. One disruption anywhere in that chain, and suddenly shelves are empty. Vertical farms located near or inside cities eliminate that complexity. Harvest to store in 48 hours, sometimes 24. Sometimes the farm is inside the grocery store, separated from customers by a glass wall. You're not buying food that was picked last week. You're buying food that was growing this morning. Labor costs tell another part of this story. Traditional farming is physically demanding work in often harsh conditions. Early mornings, extreme temperatures, exposure to chemicals, repetitive stress injuries, and it's seasonal work, which means farm workers often struggle to find stable year-round employment. Vertical farms operate inside climate-controlled buildings, where automation handles much of the physical labor. Employees work in safer, more comfortable conditions with steadier employment. Labor costs run about 30% lower than traditional farms, not because workers are paid less, but because automation does the heavy lifting and workers focus on monitoring, maintenance, and management. Now, let's be honest about what vertical farming can't do, at least not yet. It excels at leafy greens, herbs, strawberries, tomatoes, peppers, high-value crops with short growth cycles that grow well in controlled environments. It's not growing wheat, not growing corn, not growing rice, the staple grains that feed most of humanity. Those crops need too much space, take too long to mature, and sell for too little per kilogram to make economic sense in a vertical farm. Could that change? Maybe. But for now, vertical farming is solving a specific piece of the puzzle: fresh produce in cities, grown close to where people eat it, using a fraction of the resources traditional agriculture demands. The market thinks this matters. The vertical farming industry was valued at $6.22 billion in 2024. Projections suggest it will reach nearly $40 billion by 2032, growing at 26.4% annually. In 2020, vertical farming startups in Europe alone attracted $500 million in venture capital investment. That's real money betting on real growth. But money flowing in doesn't guarantee success. Several high-profile vertical farming companies have failed in recent years, running out of cash before achieving profitability. The technology works, but the economics are still challenging. Energy costs, initial capital investment, competition with cheap conventional produce trucked in from regions with lower labor costs. Making vertical farming pencil out financially requires getting a lot of things right simultaneously: location, energy sources, crop selection, automation level, market access. The farms that are succeeding tend to share certain characteristics. They're located near dense urban populations, willing to pay a premium for ultra-fresh, local, pesticide-free produce. They've secured long-term contracts with grocery chains or restaurants that guarantee consistent demand. They've optimized energy usage through greenhouse designs or renewable power sources. They're growing high-margin crops where quality and freshness command premium prices. What we're watching is a technology climbing the learning curve. Early vertical farms were expensive experiments. Current ones are profitable businesses. Future ones will be commodity-scale operations driving down costs through volume and refinement. It's the same pattern solar panels followed, or electric vehicles, or any technology that starts niche and scales to mainstream. By 2050, vertical farms won't replace traditional agriculture. They'll complement it. Fields will still grow wheat and corn and soybeans, but cities will grow their own vegetables, their own herbs, their own berries. The 3,000-mile salad will become the 3-mile salad. Water use drops. Land use drops. Transportation emissions drop. Food security rises because cities become less dependent on vulnerable supply chains stretching across continents. The vertical revolution is really about bringing food production back to where people actually live. For 10,000 years, we moved to where the food was. Now, we're learning to grow food where we are. That shift, quiet and gradual but accelerating, is one piece of how we'll feed 10 billion people without needing 593 million more hectares of farmland. And it's already happening, not in the future, right now. In Texas, in Singapore, in the Netherlands, in abandoned buildings in Detroit, and on rooftops in Tokyo, and in warehouses in Dubai. Quietly, systematically, growing up instead of out. There's a moment coming, probably within your lifetime, when someone will order a steak at a restaurant and not think twice about the fact that no cow died to provide it. Not because they're eating a plant-based substitute trying to mimic meat, because they're eating actual beef, grown from actual bovine cells, just not inside an actual cow. That moment hasn't arrived yet, but it's closer than most people realize. By 2050, humanity will consume 88% more ruminant meat than we do today. 88%. That's the projection based on population growth and dietary shifts as developing countries get wealthier and people eat more protein-rich foods, we're talking about hundreds of millions of additional tons of beef, lamb, pork, chicken. And here's the problem. Livestock already accounts for 10 to 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Producing a kilogram of beef requires 15,000 liters of water and generates greenhouse gases equivalent to driving a car for 160 kilometers. Scale that up by 88%, and you're looking at an environmental catastrophe. Unless we change how meat is made. Cultivated meat, lab-grown meat, cultured meat, cell-based meat. Different names for the same basic process. Growing animal tissue from cells in controlled environments called bioreactors, without raising and slaughtering animals. It sounds like science fiction, but the science is surprisingly straightforward. We've been growing cells in labs for over a century, for medical research, for pharmaceutical development, for fertility treatments. What's new is applying that process to produce food at scale. The process starts with a biopsy, a small sample of cells taken from a living animal, usually stem cells or myoblasts, which are precursor cells that naturally develop into muscle tissue. These cells are placed in a bioreactor, which is essentially a large vessel that mimics the conditions inside an animal's body. Temperature controlled, oxygen levels managed, nutrients delivered through what's called cell culture media, a mixture of amino acids, vitamins, minerals, sugars, and growth factors that cells need to multiply. Inside the bioreactor, those cells do what cells naturally do. They divide. One cell becomes two. Two become four. Four become eight. Exponential growth. Within weeks, what started as a tiny sample becomes millions, then billions of cells. For ground meat products like burgers or sausages, these cells can be harvested and combined directly. For structured meat like steaks or chicken breasts, the cells are grown on scaffolds, three-dimensional frameworks that guide tissue formation into specific shapes and textures. The scaffold mimics bone, sinew, and connective tissue, giving the final product the structure of conventional meat. By 2025, several companies have moved beyond laboratory experiments to pilot-scale production. Bioreactors operating at volumes between 100 and 1,000 liters. At least one company reached 15,000-liter capacity by the end of 2024. These are real facilities producing real meat that people have actually tasted and consistently described as similar to conventional meat in both flavor and texture. Which makes sense, because at the cellular level, it is conventional meat. Same DNA, same proteins, same fats, just grown differently. The potential economic impact is substantial. A 2024 analysis projected that cultivated meat could add up to 85 billion euros to the European Union economy by 2050, creating 90,000 jobs in the process. The global market is projected to reach $25 billion by 2030. Investment is flowing in from venture capital, food corporations, and governments recognizing the strategic importance of alternative protein sources. But here's where reality complicates the optimistic projections. A 2024 survey of experts in the field asked them to estimate the likelihood that cultivated meat production would exceed 100,000 metric tons annually by 2050. The median response was 54%, essentially a coin flip. Half think we'll get there, half think we won't. These are people working directly in the industry, with access to current technology and understanding of the challenges ahead. Their uncertainty should tell us something. What's holding it back? Several things, all interconnected. First, cost. The earliest cultivated meat products were extraordinarily expensive. The first lab-grown burger in 2013 cost about $300,000 to produce. Costs have dropped dramatically since then, but cultivated meat still can't compete with conventional meat on price. Cell culture media remains expensive. Bioreactor construction requires significant capital investment. Energy costs for maintaining precise environmental controls add up. Scaling from pilot facilities to industrial commodity production requires solving engineering challenges that don't have obvious solutions yet. Second, regulation. As of 2025, only a handful of countries allow cultivated meat to be sold. Singapore was first in 2020. The United States approved certain products in 2022. Australia, Israel, and a few others have followed. But large markets remain closed. Italy banned it entirely. 7 U.S. states, including Texas, have implemented bans or restrictions, with Texas enacting a 2-year prohibition in September 2025 that immediately sparked lawsuits from companies like Wildtype and Upside Foods. These legal battles create uncertainty that makes investment riskier and slows development. Third, consumer acceptance. Surveys show mixed results. Some people are curious and willing to try cultivated meat. Others find the concept disturbing, unnatural, or untrustworthy. Traditional meat industry lobbying has been aggressive, framing cultivated meat as fake, lab-created, inferior. The term lab-grown itself carries negative connotations for many consumers, which is why the industry prefers cultivated or cell-based. Marketing matters as much as technology. Fourth, the complexity of the product itself. Ground meat is relatively simple to produce. Thousands of individual cells grown separately and combined. But a steak is vastly more complicated. It needs to be grown as an intact piece with specific texture, marbling patterns, connective tissue structure. Getting that right requires precise control over cell differentiation, scaffold design, and maturation processes. Researchers at ETH Zurich recently made progress growing bovine muscle fibers in the lab that more closely resemble real muscle than previous efforts. But it's still far from commercial production of structured meat products. And yet, despite these challenges, the technology continues advancing. Artificial intelligence is increasingly integrated into cultivated meat production, with the market for AI in cultured meat projected to grow at nearly 40% annually through 2034. Machine learning algorithms optimize cell culture media formulations. Sensors integrated into bioreactors collect continuous data that AI analyzes to improve efficiency. Process automation reduces costs and increases consistency. The environmental benefits remain compelling. Cultivated meat could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 96% compared to conventional beef production. Land use could drop by 99%. Water use could fall by 98%. No antibiotics needed, which addresses the growing crisis of antibiotic resistance in medicine. No contamination risk from E. coli or salmonella that plague conventional meat processing. Safer, cleaner, drastically less resource intensive. But cultivated meat isn't the only protein transformation underway. While companies work on growing beef and chicken in bioreactors, other alternatives are already available at scale. Cricket flour, for example. Insects have been eaten by humans for millennia in many cultures, but Western countries largely avoided them. That's changing. Crickets are approximately 65% protein by dry weight. They require minimal water, minimal land, minimal feed compared to cattle. They can be raised in vertical farms, harvested efficiently, and processed into flour that functions similarly to conventional protein powder in recipes. Several companies now sell cricket-based protein bars, flour, and pasta. The taste is mild, slightly nutty. The environmental footprint is a fraction of beef or even chicken. Seaweed represents another option. Certain species contain protein concentrations above 80% purity, higher than fish meal at 65%. Seaweed requires no fresh water, no fertilizer, no pesticides. It grows in the ocean, absorbing carbon dioxide and nitrogen as it develops. Harvesting seaweed doesn't deplete fish stocks. It actually improves water quality. The protein extracted from seaweed can be used in processed foods, animal feed, or cultivated directly as a food source. These alternatives won't replace meat for most people. Cultural preferences run deep. Meat is central to cuisines worldwide, embedded in traditions, celebrations, identities. Asking people to give it up entirely is asking them to change fundamental aspects of how they eat and socialize. That's a hard sell. But asking people to eat some cultivated meat, some plant-based meat, some conventional meat, some insect protein, some seaweed-based products, that's a portfolio approach. No single solution dominates, but collectively, they reduce the demand on resource-intensive conventional livestock production. By 2050, if projections hold, the global population will be eating more protein than ever before. Some of that will come from cattle raised on pastures and chickens in barns, methods that have fed humanity for centuries. Some will come from bioreactors, growing muscle tissue cell by cell. Some will come from insects and algae and plants engineered to deliver complete protein profiles. The mix will vary by region, by culture, by economic development, by infrastructure and regulatory frameworks. What seems certain is that conventional livestock production alone can't sustainably meet an 88% increase in demand. The land doesn't exist, the water doesn't exist, the atmospheric capacity to absorb additional emissions doesn't exist. Something has to change. Cultivated meat is one piece of that change, not a guaranteed piece, not a miracle solution arriving tomorrow, but a technology moving from laboratory curiosity to pilot production to early commercialization, funded by billions in investment, backed by research at major universities, approved by regulators in multiple countries, consumed by early adopters willing to pay premium prices. The steak that comes from a bioreactor instead of a feedlot may not be common by 2050, but it will exist. It will be improving. It will be getting cheaper. It will be part of how 10 billion people get the protein they need without turning Earth's remaining forests into pastures and its rivers into irrigation systems for feed crops. Whether you find that idea appealing or unsettling or simply practical doesn't change the trajectory. The protein transformation is underway, quietly, incrementally, in research centers and pilot facilities and venture-backed startups around the world. Meat without animals. Not science fiction. Not quite mainstream, but getting closer every year. For most of human history, farming has been an exercise in educated guessing. You plant seeds. You hope for the right amount of rain. You fertilize the whole field because you don't know which parts need it most. You spray pesticides across every row because one section might have pests. You irrigate uniformly because checking soil moisture in every square meter would take days. You harvest when the calendar says it's time, not necessarily when the crop is actually at peak ripeness. This approach worked well enough to feed billions, but it's wasteful, extraordinarily wasteful. Studies show that traditional farming uses 20 to 30% more water, fertilizer, and pesticides than crops actually need. That excess runs off into rivers, pollutes groundwater, kills beneficial insects, erodes soil. It costs farmers money and damages the environment simultaneously. But what if instead of treating an entire field as a single uniform entity, you could treat every plant individually? What if sensors told you precisely which square meter needed water and which didn't? What if cameras could identify weeds at the seedling stage and remove them mechanically before they competed with crops? What if artificial intelligence analyzed weather patterns, soil conditions, and crop health in real time to make decisions more accurately than any human farmer could? That's precision agriculture. And it's not theoretical. It's operating right now in fields across Italy, Austria, Australia, Pakistan, and increasingly everywhere farmers face pressure to produce more food with fewer resources. The foundation of precision agriculture is data. Massive amounts of it, collected continuously from multiple sources. Soil sensors measure moisture levels, pH, temperature, nutrient concentrations. They're buried at various depths throughout fields, transmitting readings wirelessly every few minutes. Some systems use hundreds of sensors per hectare, creating detailed maps of underground conditions that change throughout the day and season. Above ground, satellites pass overhead multiple times daily, capturing multispectral images that reveal information invisible to human eyes. Healthy plants reflect near-infrared light differently than stressed plants. Water-saturated soil has a different spectral signature than dry soil. Diseases often show up in satellite imagery before symptoms are visible to someone walking through the field. These satellites feed data to ground-based systems that process the information and generate actionable insights. Drones fly lower, capturing even higher resolution images. They can spot pest infestations in specific rows, identify drainage problems, monitor crop height and density, assess damage from storms. Some carry thermal cameras that detect temperature variations, indicating irrigation issues. Others use LiDAR to create three-dimensional maps of fields, measuring topography with centimeter-level accuracy. On the ground, the equipment itself has transformed. GPS-guided tractors drive themselves with precision that surpasses human operators. Early systems in the late 1990s were crude, losing signal whenever a tree or building blocked line of sight to satellites, sometimes taking 15 minutes to reconnect. Modern systems use multiple satellite constellations and correction signals to achieve accuracy within 2 centimeters. Auto steering keeps equipment perfectly aligned across passes, eliminating overlap and gaps that waste fuel and inputs. But the real transformation comes from variable rate application technology. Instead of spreading fertilizer uniformly, these systems adjust application rates second by second based on prescription maps generated from soil tests and satellite imagery. Areas with adequate nutrients receive less. Areas deficient receive more. The result is healthier crops using 15 to 25% less fertilizer. That's money saved for farmers and pollution prevented in watersheds. Irrigation represents one of the most impactful applications. Traditional irrigation often operates on schedules, turning on timers regardless of whether rain fell yesterday or soil still holds adequate moisture. Precision systems use real-time soil moisture data, weather forecasts, and crop growth models to determine exactly when and how much to water. In Pakistan, alternate wet-dry rice cultivation managed through precision irrigation has dramatically reduced water use while maintaining yields. Given that agriculture consumes 70% of global freshwater withdrawals, even modest improvements in irrigation efficiency have massive downstream effects. The software tying all this together is increasingly powered by artificial intelligence. Machine learning algorithms analyze years of data to identify patterns humans would never notice. They correlate satellite imagery with eventual yields to predict harvest quantities months in advance. They simulate how crops will respond to different fertilizer regimes under various weather scenarios. They forecast pest outbreaks based on temperature, humidity, and historical patterns. These AI systems don't just analyze past data. They make active decisions. Autonomous robots navigate fields, identifying weeds with computer vision, then remove them mechanically at the root level without disturbing crops. This eliminates herbicide use entirely for weed control. Other robots spray pesticides or fertilizers only on plants that need treatment, detected through real-time image analysis. The robots work continuously, day and night, with consistency no human crew could match. Some systems have progressed to full automation. Robotic greenhouses manage planting, watering, monitoring, and harvesting with minimal human intervention. They use 90 to 95% less water than field farming and require no pesticides because the controlled environment excludes pests. Cloud-connected sensors transmit status updates to farmers' phones, alerting them to problems before crops suffer significant damage. The economic impact is substantial. Farms implementing precision agriculture report costs reduced by 20 to 30% through more efficient use of inputs. Yields increase 10 to 30% through optimized growing conditions. Waste of fertilizers, water, and pesticides drops 15 to 25% by applying them only where needed. Labor requirements decrease as robots handle repetitive tasks that previously required teams of workers. The market reflects this value. Agricultural robotics was valued at $3.43 billion in 2019. Projections suggest it will reach $36.86 billion by 2027, growing at a compound annual growth rate of 34.5%. In 2021 alone, over 700 million euros flowed into farm robotics startups across more than 70 deals. This isn't speculative money chasing distant possibilities. It's investment in technology already proving profitable at commercial scale. Adoption faces barriers, of course. The upfront cost of sensors, robots, and software platforms can run into hundreds of thousands of dollars for larger operations. Smaller farms struggle to justify that investment, especially when profit margins are thin and uncertain. Lack of clear regulation around autonomous farm equipment creates legal uncertainty. Who's liable if an autonomous tractor causes an accident? What happens to the data these systems collect? Farmers worry about privacy, about corporations owning information about their land and operations. Interoperability presents another challenge. Different manufacturers use incompatible systems. A farmer might buy a GPS-guided planter from one company, a variable rate sprayer from another, and sensors from a third, only to discover they don't communicate with each other. Industry standards are slowly emerging, but progress is uneven. And there's simple skepticism. Farming is a conservative profession, necessarily so. When your livelihood depends on successful harvests, experimenting with unproven technology feels risky. Many farmers prefer methods they understand, that their parents and grandparents used, that feel reliable even if they're less efficient. Convincing them to trust algorithms and robots requires demonstrated results over multiple seasons. But necessity is a powerful motivator. The agricultural workforce is aging. In Europe and the United States, the average farmer is approaching 60 years old. Younger generations are moving to cities for less physically demanding work with more predictable income. Labor shortages are chronic and worsening. 55% of farmers report being impacted by labor shortages, with 31% shifting to less labor-intensive crops as a result. Climate change adds urgency. Weather patterns are becoming more variable and extreme. Droughts last longer. Floods arrive with less warning. Traditional planting calendars based on historical climate data no longer apply. Farmers need systems that adapt to conditions as they unfold, not as they were decades ago. Precision agriculture provides that adaptability through continuous monitoring and rapid response. By 2050, farms will look radically different than they do today. Not because farmers abandoned traditional methods entirely, but because they augmented them with tools that eliminate waste and increase resilience. Fields will be monitored by networks of sensors feeding data to AI systems that optimize every input. Fleets of autonomous robots will handle planting, weeding, spraying, and harvesting with minimal human supervision. Drones will patrol continuously, identifying problems the moment they emerge. Satellites will track crop health across entire regions, enabling coordinated responses to emerging threats. Farmers won't disappear, but their role will shift from manual labor to data management and strategic decision-making. They'll spend less time driving tractors and more time analyzing reports, adjusting algorithms, planning crop rotations based on predictive models. The expertise required will change from physical skills to technological fluency. This transition is already underway. It started slowly in the 1990s with GPS-guided equipment that barely worked. It accelerated in the 2010s as sensors became cheaper and wireless connectivity spread to rural areas. By 2025, precision agriculture is standard practice on large commercial farms in developed countries and spreading rapidly to smaller operations and developing regions. The reason is simple. It works. It produces more food using fewer resources with greater reliability. In a world heading toward 10 billion people, where climate is destabilizing and fresh water is scarce, that's not a luxury. It's a requirement. Precision agriculture won't solve every problem. It doesn't address land availability or crop diversity or distribution inequities, but it directly attacks waste. The gap between what we grow and what we could grow if every plant received exactly what it needed, exactly when it needed it. Closing that gap means we can feed more people without expanding farmland into forests, without draining more rivers for irrigation, without saturating soil with excess chemicals that poison ecosystems downstream. When AI meets soil, something unexpected happens. Farming becomes more efficient, yes, but it also becomes more sustainable. The same technology that maximizes yield also minimizes environmental impact. They're not competing goals. They're the same goal approached with better information. By 2050, the farmer checking soil moisture by hand will seem as quaint as the farmer using oxen to plow fields. Not wrong, not obsolete, but no longer the standard. The future of farming is digital, autonomous, and precise. Not because technology is inherently superior, but because feeding 10 billion people without destroying Earth requires using every advantage we can develop. And that future is arriving faster than most people realize. There's a field in Kenya where maize grows in conditions that would have killed it 10 years ago. The drought has lasted months. The soil is cracked and dry. Temperatures push into the 40s during the day. And yet the plants stand tall, their leaves still green, their ears still developing kernels. Not because the rains came. They didn't. Not because farmers irrigated constantly. They can't afford to. But because the genetic code inside those plants has been edited to survive stress that previous varieties couldn't tolerate. This isn't science fiction. It's not even particularly new. It's happening right now, and it represents one of the most significant tools humanity has for adapting agriculture to a climate that's changing faster than traditional breeding methods can keep pace with. By 2050, climate models project more frequent droughts, more intense heat waves, more variable rainfall patterns. The crops that feed us today were developed for the climate of the past century. Many won't thrive in the conditions coming. Some won't survive at all. We can wait decades for traditional selective breeding to catch up, or we can use gene editing to make precise changes in years instead of generations. That choice is already being made. The question isn't whether gene editing will be part of agriculture's future. It's how quickly we can scale it responsibly while navigating the ethical, regulatory, and public acceptance challenges that come with any technology that modifies the genetic code of living organisms. The tool driving this revolution is CRISPR-Cas9, a gene editing system that works with remarkable precision. CRISPR stands for clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats, a mouthful of a name for what's essentially a molecular scissors guided by RNA. Scientists discovered this system in bacteria, where it functions as a primitive immune system, cutting up viral DNA that invades the cell. Researchers adapted it to edit specific genes in any organism, including plants. The process is straightforward, at least conceptually. You identify the gene you want to modify. You design a guide RNA that matches the DNA sequence at that location. You introduce the CRISPR-Cas9 system into the plant cell. The guide RNA leads the Cas9 protein to the target gene like a bloodhound following a scent. The Cas9 cuts the DNA at that precise spot. The cell's natural repair mechanisms kick in, either disabling the gene or inserting a modified version. What makes this revolutionary is the precision. Traditional genetic modification involved inserting genes somewhat randomly into a genome, hoping they'd integrate properly and express correctly. CRISPR targets exact locations. Traditional breeding required crossing plants and waiting to see which offspring inherited desired traits, a process taking years or decades. CRISPR makes specific edits in a single generation. The drought tolerance work happening right now demonstrates what's possible. Researchers have identified multiple genes that regulate how plants respond to water stress. One is called Argos-8 in maize. In normal conditions, this gene limits how many ears a plant produces, presumably to conserve resources. But during drought, having Argos-8 active actually helps. Scientists used CRISPR to modify Argos-8 expression, and the result was maize plants that produced more grain under drought conditions in actual field trials, not just greenhouses. These weren't marginal improvements. These were plants that survived and yielded where unmodified varieties failed. Rice, which feeds half the planet, has seen similar advances. A gene called SAPK2 regulates stress response pathways. Editing it creates rice varieties with enhanced drought tolerance without sacrificing yield under normal conditions. That's critical because early drought-resistant varieties often grew slowly or produced less grain, which made farmers reluctant to plant them unless drought was certain. New CRISPR-edited varieties maintain normal yields in good years while surviving bad ones. Wheat is getting the same treatment. Researchers have modified genes like TADREB2 and TAERF3, which control drought stress responses. The edited wheat lines show improved tolerance to both drought and heat stress, increasingly important as climate patterns shift and extreme weather becomes routine. But drought isn't the only target. Salinity tolerance matters in regions where irrigation has left soil saturated with salt. Disease resistance is crucial everywhere, as pathogens evolve and spread into new territories as temperatures shift. Nutritional content can be enhanced, addressing micronutrient deficiencies that affect billions. Shelf life can be extended, reducing post-harvest losses that currently waste 30% of food production. Each of these represents a gene or set of genes that can be edited to improve crop performance. The speed of development is accelerating. What took a decade using traditional methods now takes 2 or 3 years with CRISPR. And because the technology is relatively affordable compared to older genetic modification techniques, smaller research institutions and developing countries can use it. This isn't just large corporations editing crops. It's university labs, government research centers, agricultural institutes in countries directly threatened by climate change, working on crops that matter to their own food security. The ethical landscape around gene editing is complex and evolving. Unlike traditional genetic modification, which often involves inserting genes from different species, CRISPR typically makes changes that could theoretically occur through natural mutation or traditional breeding. It's just doing it faster and more precisely. Many regulatory frameworks are beginning to distinguish between these approaches, treating CRISPR-edited crops more like conventionally bred varieties than genetically modified organisms, at least when no foreign DNA is introduced. But public perception lags behind the science. Surveys show significant portions of populations in Europe and North America remain skeptical of any genetic modification in food, regardless of the method. The term gene editing triggers anxiety. People worry about unintended consequences, about corporations controlling food supplies, about rushing technology to market without adequate testing. These concerns aren't entirely unfounded. Every technology carries risks. Early applications might have effects researchers didn't anticipate. Regulatory oversight matters. Long-term monitoring matters. But the risks of not using gene editing also deserve consideration. The risk that crops fail as climate shifts, that droughts devastate yields, that diseases spread unchecked, that billions face food insecurity because agriculture couldn't adapt fast enough. It's a balance between the known risks of climate change and the hypothetical risks of gene editing, between the slow certainty of traditional breeding and the rapid uncertainty of new methods, between caution and urgency. By 2025, gene-edited crops are already in commercial production in multiple countries. The United States has approved several. Brazil, Argentina, Japan, Australia, Israel, and others have regulatory frameworks that permit CRISPR-edited crops under certain conditions. China is investing heavily in the technology. India is conducting field trials. The European Union remains more cautious, with stricter regulations that many scientists argue are based more on politics than risk assessment. The market is responding. Investment in agricultural biotechnology focused on gene editing has grown substantially. Startups are developing edited varieties of tomatoes, strawberries, soybeans, canola, and dozens of other crops. Major seed companies are integrating CRISPR into their breeding programs. Research consortia are sharing edited germplasm with developing countries to help them adapt to regional challenges. The timeline to 2050 involves multiple stages. In the 2020s, we're seeing the first wave of CRISPR-edited crops reach markets, mostly focused on single traits like disease resistance or extended shelf life. In the 2030s, second-generation edits will address multiple traits simultaneously, creating varieties with enhanced drought tolerance, heat tolerance, disease resistance, and improved nutrition all in one plant. By the 2040s, climate-adapted varieties will be standard, developed specifically for the conditions projected for different regions. Farmers won't be planting crops bred for the climate of 1990. They'll be planting crops designed for 2040. This doesn't mean every crop will be gene-edited. Organic agriculture will continue. Traditional varieties valued for taste or cultural significance will persist. Regional preferences and regulatory differences will create a patchwork of adoption rates. But the baseline expectation is that staple crops, the wheat and rice and maize that feed billions, will increasingly incorporate edits that make them resilient to the climate challenges ahead. The alternative is agricultural collapse in regions where traditional varieties can no longer cope, where droughts last too long, where heat waves exceed physiological limits, where new pests and diseases exploit shifting ecosystems. Gene editing isn't a perfect solution. It doesn't address everything. It doesn't solve distribution inequities, or economic access, or political instability. But it does give crops the capacity to survive conditions they weren't evolved to handle. And in a world where 10 billion people need to eat while the climate destabilizes, that capacity might be the difference between adequate yields and widespread crop failure. Between farmers adapting to new conditions and farmers abandoning land that no longer produces. Between managed transition and chaotic disruption. CRISPR and other gene editing tools are part of how agriculture becomes climate resilient. They're not replacing traditional farming. They're enabling traditional farming to continue in conditions that would otherwise make it impossible. They're buying time for adaptation. They're creating options where otherwise there might be only failure. By 2050, the drought-tolerant maize growing in Kenya won't be unusual. It will be normal, expected, the baseline for how agriculture operates in a changed world. Not because gene editing solved every problem, but because it solved one critical problem: giving plants the ability to thrive when conditions aren't optimal. And when you're feeding 10 billion people, optimal conditions are a luxury we can't count on anymore. Here's a number that should make you uncomfortable. 20% of all food produced in the European Union is wasted, not consumed inefficiently, not used for secondary purposes. Wasted, thrown away, gone. While 673 million people worldwide went hungry in 2024, the EU alone discarded 1/5 of everything it grew, processed, transported, and displayed on shelves. Scale that globally, and the waste reaches staggering proportions. Roughly 30% of all food produced for human consumption never gets eaten. That's 1.3 billion tons annually. Enough to feed several billion additional people. Enough to close the 56% food gap we need to bridge by 2050 without producing a single additional calorie. So before we talk about growing more food with vertical farms and gene-edited crops and precision agriculture, we need to talk about the food we're already producing and simply throwing away. Because if we could cut food waste in half, we'd be halfway to feeding 10 billion people without expanding agriculture at all. The waste happens everywhere, but not uniformly. Different stages of the supply chain leak food in different ways for different reasons. Understanding where and why food disappears is the first step toward preventing it. Start at the farm. Harvest losses occur when produce is left in fields because it doesn't meet cosmetic standards. A carrot that grew crooked, a tomato with an irregular shape, an apple with a small blemish. Nutritionally identical to perfect specimens, but retailers won't accept them because consumers have been trained to expect visual perfection. So farmers leave them to rot or plow them under because harvesting and transporting produce that won't sell costs more than it's worth. In developing countries, post-harvest losses are even higher, driven by lack of infrastructure. Without proper storage facilities, grain spoils in humid conditions. Without refrigerated transport, vegetables wilt before reaching markets. Without processing facilities, fruit rots during seasonal gluts when supply overwhelms immediate demand. These aren't failures of knowledge or effort. They're failures of investment in the basic infrastructure that developed countries take for granted. Move to processing and manufacturing. Food gets rejected for minor quality deviations. A batch of yogurt slightly off color. Bread loaves that don't rise to the exact specified height. Production overruns that exceed contracted amounts. Much of this rejected food is safe and nutritious, but disposing of it is often easier and cheaper than finding alternative uses. Retail is where waste becomes visible to consumers. Supermarkets overstock to create an impression of abundance. Empty shelves signal scarcity, which makes shoppers uncomfortable and drives them to competitors. So stores keep shelves full, knowing some products will expire before purchase. Bakery departments bake fresh bread throughout the day, discarding what wasn't sold from previous batches. Produce sections remove fruits and vegetables at the first sign of wilting. Much of this food is still edible, but retailers prioritize appearance over waste reduction because they believe that's what customers expect. Then there's the confusion around date labels. Best before, use by, sell by, display until. These mean different things in different jurisdictions, and most consumers don't know which indicate actual safety concerns versus quality degradation. The result is massive amounts of food thrown away based on arbitrary dates, when the food itself is perfectly safe to eat for days or weeks longer. Studies show that clarifying these labels could reduce household food waste by as much as 20%. Households are the final stage, and in developed countries, the largest source of waste. People buy more than they need, seduced by bulk discounts or impulse purchases. They cook too much and don't save leftovers. They forget about food in the back of refrigerators until it spoils. They misinterpret date labels and discard food prematurely. They have the luxury of being careless because food is relatively cheap and abundant. That luxury has a cost, though. The environmental resources that went into producing that food, wasted. The labor that grew it, wasted. The water, land, energy, all wasted. Quantifying the impact requires looking at the full supply chain. In the EU alone, food waste generates 252 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent annually. That's roughly 5% of the bloc's total greenhouse gas emissions, just from food that gets produced and never eaten. Globally, if food waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter after China and the United States. The water footprint is equally staggering. Wasted food represents wasted irrigation. Given that agriculture already consumes 70% of global freshwater withdrawals, throwing away 30% of food output means we're wasting roughly 20% of agricultural water use on food that never gets consumed. But here's the important part. This is a solvable problem. Not easily, not immediately, but solvable in ways that many other challenges aren't. We don't need to invent new technology. We need to implement existing solutions at scale. The European Union has set binding targets. A 10% reduction in food waste at processing and manufacturing stages by 2030. A 30% reduction at retail and household levels by the same year. These aren't aspirational goals. They're legal requirements with enforcement mechanisms and reporting standards. Whether they'll be met is uncertain, but the framework exists. The solutions vary by stage. At the farm level, initiatives are expanding to accept cosmetically imperfect produce. Some retailers now sell ugly fruits and vegetables at discounted prices, reframing imperfection as value rather than defect. Processing facilities are finding secondary uses for rejected food, converting it into animal feed, compost, or biogas rather than landfilling it. Cold chain infrastructure investment in developing countries is critical. Refrigerated storage and transport prevent post-harvest losses that currently reach 40% in some regions. These aren't glamorous investments. They're warehouses and trucks and power systems. But they work. Countries that have built out cold chains have dramatically reduced food losses at the production and distribution stages. Date labeling reform is straightforward. Standardized terminology across jurisdictions. Use by means safety concern. Don't consume after this date. Best before means quality concern. Still safe after this date, but flavor or texture may decline. That's it. 2 terms, clearly defined, consistently used. Implementation is mostly a regulatory matter rather than a technical challenge. Technology helps at multiple points. QR codes on packaging linked to databases showing actual product status rather than printed dates. Sensors in refrigerated trucks monitor temperature continuously, providing evidence that cold chain wasn't broken. AI-powered inventory systems in supermarkets optimize ordering to match actual demand rather than habitual overstocking. These systems are already operational in pilot programs, showing 20 to 30% reductions in retail waste where implemented. Food donation frameworks matter enormously. In many jurisdictions, complex liability laws discourage businesses from donating food nearing expiration dates because they fear being held responsible if someone gets sick. Legal reforms that protect donors acting in good faith remove that barrier. France implemented such reforms in 2016, requiring large supermarkets to donate unsold food rather than discarding it. Food banks report significant increases in donations following these changes. Consumer behavior is harder to shift, but not impossible. Educational campaigns highlighting the scale and impact of household waste have shown modest success. Simple interventions, like providing smaller plates in cafeterias, reduce serving sizes and thus food left uneaten. Mobile apps, connecting consumers with restaurants and grocers, selling surplus food at discounted prices before it spoils, have gained traction in urban areas. The economics are compelling. Reducing food waste saves money at every stage. Farmers don't waste resources growing food that won't sell. Processors reduce disposal costs. Retailers decrease losses from expired inventory. Consumers spend less on food they don't actually consume. One analysis estimated that halving food waste globally could save $400 billion annually while feeding millions more people. By 2030, the goal is modest but meaningful reductions. 10% here, 30% there. These aren't transformative numbers, but they don't need to be. A 30% reduction in food waste globally would provide enough food to significantly narrow the gap between current production and 2050 needs. Combined with increased productivity from other interventions, it makes feeding 10 billion people without expanding agriculture's footprint substantially more achievable. By 2050, the vision is near zero waste in developed countries and dramatically reduced losses in developing regions. Food not sold at retail gets donated to food banks or processed into other products. Cosmetically imperfect produce enters markets as standard rather than exception. Cold chains in Africa and Asia prevent post-harvest spoilage. Date labels are clear and universally understood. Households waste minimally because cultural norms have shifted and economic incentives favor efficiency. This isn't utopian thinking. It's systems optimization applied to a problem with known solutions. The barriers are primarily economic, regulatory, and behavioral rather than technical. Infrastructure requires investment. Regulations need reform. Behaviors must change. All of these are difficult, but none are impossible. What makes food waste particularly frustrating is that it's entirely self-inflicted. Drought is a natural phenomenon we must adapt to. Climate change is a long-term challenge requiring decades to address. But food waste is something we're actively doing right now that we could simply stop doing. The resources are already invested. The food is already grown. We just need to not throw it away. That makes it one of the most immediate and impactful interventions available. No waiting for technology to mature. No regulatory approval for new gene edits. No construction of new facilities. Just policy changes, infrastructure investments, and behavioral shifts that prevent waste of resources already committed. If we want to feed 10 billion people without destroying Earth, we need to start by not destroying the food we're already producing. The waste equation is simpler than the production equation. Produce less waste, feed more people, use fewer resources. Solve that, and we're dramatically closer to solving the larger challenge. And unlike many problems facing agriculture, this one is entirely within our control. We created the waste. We can eliminate it. The question is whether we will. We live on a planet whose name is a lie. We call it Earth, when 71% of its surface is ocean. For 10,000 years of agricultural history, we've treated that vast expanse as something separate. A place to fish, a place to transport goods, a place to dispose of waste, but not a place to farm. That's changing. It has to change. Because when we talk about feeding 10 billion people without converting more forests into fields, without draining more rivers for irrigation, without releasing more emissions into an atmosphere already struggling to remain stable, we need to acknowledge that we've been ignoring the the majority of our planet's productive capacity. The ocean isn't just a source of wild-caught fish. It's a three-dimensional growing space where food can be cultivated with environmental impacts radically different from terrestrial agriculture. Sometimes better, sometimes more complicated, but different enough that it deserves serious attention as part of how humanity feeds itself in 2050. Start with seaweed, not the dried sheets wrapped around sushi, though that's one form. The broader category of marine macroalgae that grows in coastal waters worldwide, requiring nothing from humans except space and time. No fresh water for irrigation because it grows in saltwater. No fertilizer because it absorbs nutrients directly from the water around it. No pesticides because the marine environment naturally regulates pests. No land because it grows underwater or on floating structures. The protein content in certain seaweed species exceeds 80% purity after extraction. That's higher than the 65% typical of fish meal, which has been a staple protein source in animal feed for decades. Seaweed protein can substitute for fish meal in aquaculture feeds, reducing pressure on wild fish populations caught specifically to feed farmed fish. It can also be processed for human consumption, though Western palates are still adjusting to seaweed as a primary protein source rather than a garnish or side dish. Beyond protein, seaweed cultivation offers environmental benefits that terrestrial agriculture struggles to match. As it grows, seaweed absorbs carbon dioxide from the water. It also absorbs excess nitrogen and phosphorus, the same nutrients that cause dead zones when agricultural runoff floods into coastal areas. Instead of degrading water quality like land-based farming often does, seaweed cultivation can actually improve it by removing pollutants. This is called extractive aquaculture, growing organisms that take things out of the water rather than adding feed and generating waste. The growth rates are impressive. Some kelp species can grow 0.5 meter per day under optimal conditions. That's faster than bamboo, previously considered the fastest growing plant. You can harvest seaweed multiple times per year in many regions, creating a continuous production cycle similar to vertical farming, but occurring naturally in the ocean without artificial lighting or climate control. Scaling seaweed cultivation faces challenges, though. You need suitable coastal areas with the right water temperature, nutrient levels, and wave conditions. You need infrastructure for harvesting and processing. You need markets willing to buy seaweed products at prices that make the operation profitable. And you need to understand the ecological impacts of large-scale cultivation on local marine ecosystems. That last point matters more than most people realize. Recent research on large-scale ocean farming has raised important questions about nutrient drawdown. When you cultivate vast areas of seaweed, you're removing nutrients from the water. Those nutrients support other marine life. Take out too much, and you might reduce productivity elsewhere in the ecosystem. Some models suggest that large-scale seaweed farming could reduce wild fishery catches in surrounding areas by drawing down nutrients that would otherwise support the base of the marine food web. The carbon impact is similarly complex. If harvested seaweed is processed into food or feed, the carbon it absorbed gets released relatively quickly when that food is consumed and metabolized. The net carbon benefit is modest. If seaweed is converted into biofuel and burned, you've essentially created a carbon-neutral energy cycle, which is valuable but doesn't sequester carbon long-term. Only if seaweed is processed into products with long lifespans or deliberately sunk to deep ocean, where it won't decompose for centuries, do you get significant carbon sequestration. And those applications don't produce food for humans. Shellfish aquaculture follows similar principles. Mussels, oysters, and clams filter feed, removing particles from water as they grow. They don't require feed inputs. They actually clean water as they cultivate. A single oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day. Scale that to millions of oysters, and you're talking about significant water quality improvement in coastal areas that have suffered from pollution and eutrophication. The protein yield from shellfish isn't as high per kilogram as seaweed, but shellfish have the advantage of cultural acceptance in many cuisines. People already eat them. There's no need to convince consumers that oysters are food. The challenge is scaling production while managing environmental impacts and navigating regulatory frameworks that vary widely by country and region. Finfish aquaculture is different. Fish require feed, which means you're not practicing extractive aquaculture, but rather intensive cultivation similar to livestock farming. The environmental impacts depend heavily on what you feed the fish and how you manage waste. Traditional fish farming has been criticized for pollution, disease transmission to wild populations, and using wild-caught fish as feed, which defeats the purpose of reducing pressure on ocean ecosystems. But advances in feed technology are changing the equation. Plant-based fish feeds, insect-based feeds, and feeds incorporating seaweed protein are reducing reliance on fish meal. Recirculating aquaculture systems that filter and reuse water are eliminating pollution discharge. Land-based fish farms in controlled environments are preventing disease transmission to wild populations. These systems require more infrastructure and energy than ocean-based cultivation, making them more similar to controlled environment agriculture on land than traditional ocean farming. The global contribution of fisheries and aquaculture to protein supply is already substantial. Roughly 17% of animal protein consumed by humans comes from aquatic sources. By 2050, that percentage needs to increase if we're going to feed 10 billion people without expanding land-based livestock production by 88%. The ocean has capacity to contribute more, but only if we farm it rather than just extracting from it. The distinction matters. Wild-caught fisheries are largely at or beyond sustainable limits. Most major fish stocks are fully exploited or overfished. Increasing wild catch isn't an option without causing ecosystem collapse. But farming the ocean, growing organisms that we harvest on managed schedules without depleting wild populations, represents untapped potential. By 2050, coastal areas could host extensive seaweed and shellfish farms, providing protein for both human consumption and animal feed. These farms would integrate with other ocean uses, sharing space with shipping lanes, fishing grounds, and conservation areas through careful zoning. The farms would provide employment in coastal communities often economically depressed due to declining wild fisheries. They would improve water quality in areas currently suffering from agricultural runoff and urban pollution. And they would do it without consuming fresh water, without occupying arable land, without generating the emissions associated with terrestrial livestock. The economics are gradually becoming favorable. Seaweed farming employs millions of people globally, mostly in Asia, where the practice has been established for decades. Western countries are starting to develop their own industries, recognizing that relying entirely on land-based agriculture leaves them vulnerable to climate impacts on terrestrial farming. Investment in aquaculture infrastructure is growing, with both private capital and government funding supporting research and development. Regulatory frameworks are evolving to accommodate ocean farming. Permitting processes that once took years are being streamlined. Zoning systems that allocate ocean space for different uses are becoming more sophisticated, allowing farming in areas where it doesn't conflict with other activities. International guidelines are being developed to ensure that ocean farming in one country's waters doesn't negatively impact neighboring countries' marine resources. But challenges remain. Public perception of aquaculture is mixed. Some people see it as sustainable food production. Others associate it with environmental damage from poorly managed operations. Building trust requires demonstrating that modern aquaculture incorporates lessons from past mistakes, using better practices and tighter regulation. Environmental monitoring is crucial. Large-scale ocean farming needs continuous assessment of impacts on local ecosystems. Nutrient levels, species diversity, water quality, all require tracking to ensure that farming enhances rather than degrades marine environments. That monitoring costs money and requires expertise that many operations, especially smaller ones in developing countries, struggle to afford. Integration with existing food systems presents logistical hurdles. Seaweed harvested in coastal areas needs processing facilities to convert it into products consumers will buy. Those facilities need to be located close enough to farms to minimize transport costs, but also connected to distribution networks that can move products to markets. Building that infrastructure requires coordinated investment from multiple stakeholders. Yet the potential is substantial enough that these challenges are being addressed systematically. The ocean represents the largest unexplored frontier for food production. Not unexplored in the sense that we don't know it exists, but unexplored in the sense that we've barely begun to use it for cultivation rather than extraction. The shift from hunting and gathering to farming that happened on land 10,000 years ago is happening in the ocean right now. We're learning to farm seaweed and shellfish and fish in ways that are productive and sustainable, that provide food while improving rather than degrading the environment. By 2050, ocean farming won't replace terrestrial agriculture. It will complement it. Fields will still grow wheat and corn. Vertical farms will still produce vegetables in cities. Gene-edited crops will still provide drought tolerance. Precision agriculture will still optimize resource use. And the ocean will contribute its share, growing protein in a three-dimensional space that doesn't compete with land, doesn't consume fresh water, and doesn't add to the pressure on terrestrial ecosystems already stretched thin. The blue planet will finally live up to its name, not just as a source of wild fish caught until populations collapse, but as a managed agricultural system producing food sustainably at scales that help feed 10 billion people without requiring another 593 million hectares of land we don't have. We've been farming Earth for 10,000 years. It's time we started farming ocean too. We've walked through 7 episodes examining different approaches to feeding 10 billion people without destroying Earth. Vertical farms, stacking crops in warehouses. Cultured meat, growing in bioreactors. Precision agriculture guided by AI and sensors. Gene-edited crops surviving drought. Waste reduction throughout supply chains. Ocean farming cultivating seaweed and shellfish. Each episode focused on one piece, one technology, one intervention. But here's what matters most. None of these solutions works alone. None is sufficient by itself to close the 56% food gap, to avoid needing 593 million more hectares of land, to eliminate 11 gigatons of excess emissions. The real question isn't which solution is best. It's how they fit together into a system that actually functions at the scale required. That's what this final episode is about. Not individual technologies, but integrated systems. Not isolated successes, but coordinated transformation. Not what's possible in laboratories, but what's achievable in the messy, complicated reality of agriculture practiced across every climate zone and economic condition on Earth. Start with a basic truth. There is no single global food system. There are hundreds of regional systems, each adapted to local conditions, local crops, local diets, local infrastructure. What works in water-scarce Israel doesn't directly translate to monsoon-affected Bangladesh. What succeeds in wealthy Netherlands may not be affordable in rural Mali. Solutions must be contextual, not universal. Mali provides a useful example. The country developed a climate-smart agriculture investment plan, targeting 1.8 million people with investments between $300 and $500 million. Not billions, not revolutionary technology, relatively modest funding focused on practical interventions, improved seed varieties better suited to local conditions, drip irrigation systems that use water efficiently, weather forecasting systems that help farmers time planting and harvesting, storage facilities that prevent post-harvest losses. These aren't futuristic technologies. They're proven approaches deployed systematically. The results matter. Farmers using these methods report yield increases of 20 to 40%. Water use drops by 30 to 50%. Income rises because less crop is lost to spoilage, and farmers can sell during off-season when prices are higher. This is what integrated approach looks like on the ground. Not one miracle technology, but multiple complementary interventions reinforcing each other. Scale that pattern globally, and you start to see the convergence. Vertical farms in cities provide fresh vegetables and herbs locally, eliminating transportation emissions and water waste. Traditional farms in rural areas grow staple crops using precision agriculture to optimize inputs and reduce environmental impact. Gene-edited varieties provide drought and heat tolerance, allowing cultivation to continue in regions where climate change would otherwise make farming impossible. Cultured meat and alternative proteins gradually reduce demand for resource-intensive livestock. Waste reduction throughout supply chains ensures that more of what's produced actually gets consumed. Ocean farming contributes protein without competing for land or fresh water. Each piece addresses specific challenges in specific contexts. Vertical farms don't replace wheat production, but they do eliminate the need to transport lettuce 3,000 miles. Cultured meat won't fully substitute for conventional livestock by 2050, but even capturing 10% of the market significantly reduces emissions and land use. Gene editing doesn't solve food distribution inequality, but it does prevent crop failures that would otherwise create supply shocks. Waste reduction doesn't increase total production, but it makes existing production go 30% further. The timeline matters. These transitions don't happen overnight. They unfold in stages, each building on previous progress. By 2030, early adoption becomes mainstream adoption. Vertical farms operate in major cities worldwide, supplying perhaps 5 to 10% of vegetables consumed in urban areas. Precision agriculture becomes standard practice on commercial farms in developed countries and spreads to larger operations in developing regions. The first gene-edited crops adapted to climate stresses reach wide commercial deployment. Food waste in developed countries drops by the targeted 30% through better date labeling, improved cold chains, and redistribution systems. Cultured meat exists commercially, but remains expensive and niche. Ocean farming expands modestly, primarily in Asia, where the practice is already established. By 2040, these systems mature and scale. Vertical farming supplies 20 to 30% of vegetables in urban areas, with facilities becoming standard infrastructure in new construction. Precision agriculture operates globally, enabled by improved connectivity and falling sensor costs. Gene-edited varieties dominate staple crop production in climate-stressed regions, having proven their value through multiple seasons. Food waste approaches near zero in developed countries and drops substantially in developing regions through infrastructure investment. Cultured meat captures perhaps 10 to 15% of global meat consumption as production scales and costs fall. Ocean farming contributes measurably to global protein supply, with seaweed and shellfish production expanding in coastal areas worldwide. By 2050, the integrated system is operational, not perfect, not uniformly distributed, but functional at the scale needed to feed 10 billion people without expanding agriculture's environmental footprint beyond current levels. Total food production increases 56% through the combination of higher yields from precision agriculture and gene-edited crops, plus new production from vertical farms and ocean cultivation. Land use stabilizes or even decreases slightly as intensive methods replace extensive ones. Water use drops by 30 to 40% through precision irrigation, vertical farming's closed systems, and reduced livestock production. Emissions from agriculture fall by 20 to 30% through waste reduction, alternative proteins, and more efficient farming practices. Those numbers aren't utopian. They're based on technologies already demonstrated at commercial scale, extrapolated to wider adoption. The assumptions are that costs continue falling as technologies mature, that regulatory frameworks evolve to permit safe innovations, that infrastructure investment continues, that consumers gradually accept new food sources. All of those assumptions could be wrong. Adoption could stall. Regulations could block progress. Investment could dry up. Cultural resistance could prevent acceptance of gene-edited or cultured foods. But the opposite is also possible. Technologies could advance faster than projected. Synergies between different approaches could generate unexpected benefits. Climate impacts could accelerate adoption by making traditional methods clearly inadequate. Economic incentives could align more strongly as resource constraints tighten. The human adaptation factor shouldn't be underestimated. We've always adjusted to changing conditions. When wild grasses were scarce, we learned to cultivate them. When population outgrew local food supplies, we developed trade networks. When fertilizers became available, we adopted them despite initial skepticism. When Green Revolution varieties promised higher yields, farmers planted them despite risks. Change happens when necessity meets opportunity. By 2050, necessity will be clear. 10 billion people need to eat. Climate is less stable. Water is scarcer. Land is finite. The opportunity exists in the technologies we've examined. Whether we seize it depends on choices made over the next 25 years by farmers, corporations, governments, consumers, researchers, investors, choices about what to fund, what to regulate, what to buy, what to grow, what to study, where to invest. No single decision determines the outcome. It's the accumulation of millions of choices, some large, but most small, that gradually shifts how humanity feeds itself. A farmer deciding to try precision irrigation. A consumer willing to pay slightly more for vertical farm vegetables. A regulator approving gene-edited drought-tolerant wheat. An investor funding a cultured meat startup. A city zoning urban space for vertical farms. A country investing in cold chain infrastructure. A researcher developing improved seaweed cultivation methods. These choices are being made right now. The trajectory toward 2050 isn't fixed. It's being determined by decisions occurring today in fields and laboratories and boardrooms and regulatory offices and supermarkets and kitchens. The convergence we've described isn't inevitable. It's possible, achievable, but only if enough people choose to make it happen. The alternative isn't appealing. Traditional agriculture scaled up by 56% means converting forests to farmland, draining more rivers, releasing more emissions, degrading more soil. That path leads to food production that undermines the environmental systems food production depends on. Short-term yields purchased at the cost of long-term capacity. It's a losing trade. The integrated approach offers a different path. More productive, more efficient, more sustainable. Not perfect, not without challenges, not equally accessible everywhere immediately, but directionally correct. Moving toward systems that produce more food using fewer resources with less environmental damage. That's the convergence. Not vertical farms, or cultured meat, or gene editing, or precision agriculture, or waste reduction, or ocean farming. All of them deployed where they work best, reinforcing each other, collectively transforming how 10 billion people eat without exhausting the planet in the process. The food system of 2050 won't look like 2024. It will be more technological, more data-driven, more automated, more diverse in protein sources, more localized in vegetable production, more efficient in resource use, more resilient to climate variability. These aren't predictions with certainty. They're trajectories based on technologies already moving from laboratory to market, from pilot projects to commercial scale, from skepticism to acceptance. Humanity has always found ways to feed itself as population grew, sometimes barely, sometimes with catastrophic failures along the way, sometimes at enormous environmental cost. But we've always adapted. The question facing us now isn't whether we can feed 10 billion people. It's whether we can do it without making Earth uninhabitable for the billions who come after. The answer emerging from the convergence of these technologies is yes, probably, if we make the right choices consistently over the next 25 years, if we invest wisely, if we regulate intelligently, if we adopt pragmatically, if we integrate thoughtfully. Not certainty, possibility, which is more than we had a generation ago, before precision agriculture and CRISPR and vertical farming and cultured meat existed as viable options. We have tools now that previous generations lacked. Whether we use them well enough, fast enough, widely enough, remains to be seen. But the pieces exist. The path is visible. The convergence is underway. 10 billion people can eat without destroying Earth. The question isn't capability anymore. It's choice. And that choice is being made right now, one decision at a time, by people all over this planet who understand that how we feed ourselves determines what kind of world we leave behind.